What's going on, everyone? It's Monday morning, and as always, you know what time it is. I have got my top waiver wire pickups for week 13. Now, I know we've got still one more game left of week 12, but regardless, I wanted to give you guys an early look. And for a lot of people, this is it, make or break time last week before the start of the playoffs in the majority of leagues. So, again, I've got my top 20 waiver wire pickups, a little bit more in-depth look. So, let's get right into it. Starting with the quarterback position, this is again a tough week for finding a top-notch guy that you can just insert and rely on. But regardless, I've got a group of guys that have all very favorable matchups, starting with Derek Carr of the Raiders. And look, he just came off 253 yards, 2 touchdowns versus the Broncos, albeit without Talib because of the ejection, but still, week 13, he gets the Giants in Oakland. And look, that's a very tough place to play on the road for opposing teams. Giants don't have much going for them offensively. I expect a couple turnovers. Right now, they're a mess. And even in a struggle last week, Kirk Cousins still put up respectable numbers. I think Derek Carr can do the same at home. And believe it or not, the Raiders are still in contention for that top spot in their division. So they'll be motivated. And I believe that's going to lead to a very good game for Derek Carr in Week 13. Next, a name that we've probably forgotten about a little bit, and a guy that we might have released a couple weeks ago, Jameis Winston. Reports are coming out that he's coming closer and closer to a return. Now, he's scheduled for an MRI today. We'll see what happens, but it's worth monitoring. If he has a chance of playing, he gets a very favorable matchup versus Green Bay. Lots of injuries in that secondary. And throughout that defense, to be honest with you, you saw what the Steelers did to them on Sunday night. Now, obviously, the Steelers' offense and that of the Bucs very different. But regardless, if Winston suits up, I think he's a very nice option versus the Packers and can put up some respectable numbers. Next, another name that's off the radar a little bit maybe and going out on a limb with Jimmy Garoppolo. And this is all predicated on the injury to CJ, who exited the game late versus Seattle. Allowed Garoppolo to get in there sooner rather than later. Ideally, the 49ers would have liked him to get a little bit more time under his belt and probably start next year. But regardless, Garoppolo got in there, was able to throw in a touchdown, and looked good. Now, like I said, all of this is going to depend as the week goes on, how severe that CJ injury was. But if Garoppolo has to suit up, I will say he gets a decent matchup versus the Bears. Neither of these teams is exceptionally good. And although the Bears' defense has looked decent, I will say this, they are dealing with injuries. Leonard Floyd just got put in on IR. And to me, the Bears are looking forward to next season. That front office is a mess with John Fox. Players at this point, I think they've checked out. So I think this could be a sneaky good play if Garoppolo is the starter for Week 13. And finally, I've got a name that's familiar and been on and off many waiver wires in Trevor Siemian of the Broncos. Now look, Paxton Lynch exited their game, and what did Siemian do? He came in through 150 yards, 2 touchdowns. You know, nothing too special, but he was that game manager that he has shown that he can be. And most importantly, the reason that I like him in Week 13, he gets a very favorable Miami matchup. Miami defensively has been getting exposed completely by the last couple of teams they've played versus the Patriots, then also versus the Panthers. You saw it. And to me, I think the Broncos, combined with their defense, can put pressure on whoever it is, whether it be Moore, whether it be Cutler, and get some good points out of their offense. For that reason, I like Siemian if he is to start in Week 13. Now, let's transition to the wide receiver position, and I want to start with Josh Gordon. The reason, it's finally Week 13, and he's eligible to return. If he is available, I'd say roll the dice on him. The Browns desperately need a playmaker, and Josh Gordon can be that. As rusty as he is, to me, he's still got the skill talent. It's going to be a tough outing versus the Chargers, no doubt, but immediately with him returning, to me, he becomes the best option. And if he is available, this would be the last chance you have to add him. So even though it could be unlikely, go ahead, see if Josh Gordon is available on your waivers, and try and put in a request for him if you are desperate at receiver. Next, a guy in Dontrell Inman of the Bears, who continues to lead the Bears in terms of targets, in terms of receptions. He's the go-to guy in the Bears receiving corps. The only honestly viable option for Trubisky. He had 4 receptions, 64 yards. I know nothing special about that stat line, but he gets a much more favorable matchup in the 49ers defense. And I would say if you're very desperate again for a flex guy at the receiver position, Inman can be a decent add this week. He leads all the Bears receivers. He's become Trubisky's favorite target at this point. So go ahead, try and see if you can get him for a very favorable matchup. Another name to consider, Marquise Goodwin of the 49ers. And look, regardless whether it's CJ, whether it's Garoppolo, he is still the main option for the 49ers. Came off 4 receptions for 78 yards versus the Seahawks. And again, tough matchup versus the Bears. But look, to me, he is a guy that has a really high ceiling if Jimmy Garoppolo plays. If Jimmy is there, I think he's going to see a lot more passes, especially a lot more down the field passes. So for that reason, I like Marquise Goodwin, upgraded especially if Jimmy starts. Next, a guy in Zay Jones of the Bills, who's coming off a 10-target game, pretty much doubling that of any other receiver pass catcher on the Bills. 33 yards and a touchdown. He's seeing that chemistry with Tyrod Taylor go up, and they get a matchup versus the Patriots where you expect the Patriots to go up, so that's going to force the Bills to air it out. If Kelvin Benjamin is also unavailable again, that provides an extra boost to Zay Jones, so keep an eye out on that. If Benjamin is out, Zay Jones is a nice option, especially in PPR leagues, considering all the targets he was seeing last. And finally, rounding out the list of receivers, I actually have a tandem of guys in Cordero Patterson and Seth Roberts of the Raiders. And obviously here, this is going to be predicated on whether Crabtree gets suspended or not because of his altercation with Talib. I mean, if you saw that, that was pretty much an all-out brawl. Punches were being thrown. The skirmish continued for a while, so I could think it's very likely for Crabtree to get suspended. And again, the matchup very favorable in that of versus the Giants. I expect Derek Carr to have a big game, and I expect his pass catchers to also have one. I think outside of Cooper, you got to look at Patterson and then Seth Roberts. I think those are the 2 guys that he feels more comfortable with, and as a result, I think either of them could have very nice games. Now transitioning to the running back position, the first guy that I want to mention is Rod Smith of the Cowboys, and several reasons, beginning with the fact that Darren McFadden was cut, so that pretty much leaves just Alfred Morris and Rod Smith. Now, the Cowboys have been rolling with Alfred Morris, and we've seen since that it hasn't really worked out. They haven't won a single game without Zeke, and as far as carries being split between Smith and Morris, last week versus the Chargers, it was equal. It was 9 carries apiece. I believe Rod Smith is more involved in the passing game as well, and I think he's trending more upwards than Alfred Morris. So to me, that gives him a little bit more of an edge. And the Cowboys, on top of that, have said that they need to and have to get back to running the football successfully, just as recent as yesterday. So for that reason, I like Rod Smith. If he's available off waivers, go ahead, take a chance on him. I think sooner rather than later, you can see him becoming the starter over Morris. That wouldn't surprise me at all, and especially a nice addition if the Cowboys stay true to their word as far as having that transition to becoming a running football team again. Next, Jacquizz Rodgers of the Bucks, and this is stemming from the Doug Martin injury, possible concussion, and with the league being so cautious with this type of injury, wouldn't surprise me at all if Doug Martin sits. And I know a lot of people might say, well, what about Barber? He had 2 touchdowns, but I'll say, you know, the usage just isn't there. He did that on, what was it, 4 or 5 carries, and basically they were both 1-yard rushing touchdowns. To me, Jacquizz has more of the play appeal. He knows the system better, more of a threat in the passing game, so extra boost in terms of PPR. We saw what Le'Veon Bell did versus the Packers catching the football out of the backfield. Now, by no means is Jacquizz Le'Veon Bell-esque, but he has that ability to catch the football out of the backfield. And to me, he is the guy over Barber that should be targeted if available, especially considering the matchup and if Martin does in fact sit out. Next, Rex Burkhead of the Patriots. coming off a really impressive performance, 13 carries, 50 yards, touchdown on the ground and through the air. And a lot of this has honestly been just because the opponents defensively the Patriots have been playing just haven't been able to stop that Patriots offense. So a lot of the players offensively have been having successful games. Now, that included this last week versus the Dolphins. Gronk, Dion Lewis, Rex Burkhead himself, Brendan Cooks, and honestly, I could see that continue versus the Buffalo Bills. That Bills defense only a couple weeks removed from getting completely shredded versus the Chargers, and to me, Patriots can absolutely do the same. As the game gets out of hand, look for Rex Burkhead to get more and more carries. Nice PPR option. So for me, Rex Burkhead, a nice addition if still available and you need that flex play. And finally, Austin Ekeler of the Chargers. And quick disclaimer for him, he does have a favorable matchup in the Browns, but I will say mostly a PPR pickup here. He had 3 receptions, 55 yards last week versus the Cowboys. Majority of his points came through the passing attack, and while I do think the Chargers will pull away from the Browns, and that's going to lead to more usage for Ekeler, I still think Gordon is the main guy. Hasn't been as effective, but still has to go to him as far as the edge in the running game is concerned. Ekeler is going to be more that guy that's used for relief once the Chargers find themselves in a comfortable lead. So that does present a little bit of a risk, but to me, I think, again, in PPR leagues, if you're looking for a 10 to 13, 14 point performance from a flex play, I think although Ekeler is risky, I think the potential really is there, and especially with the running back market right now being pretty thin versus the Browns, a nice play, especially in PPR leagues. Now, making our way to the tight end position, a couple names here, starting off with Marcedes Leiws of the Jags. His name has come up a couple of times, and not a really particularly special performance this last week versus the Cardinals, but I will say this week 13 he gets the Indianapolis Colts, and if you look at the previous matchup versus the Colts, he did have 2 receptions for 29 yards and the all-important touchdown. To me, I think this is a very favorable matchup. I expect a lot of the players on the Jaguar side to have good games, and Marcedes Leiws, he is that dependable guy for Blake Bortles in times of struggle, red zone target. So I think if you need to roll the dice on a tight end target, he is a good place to begin with. Next, O.J. Howard of the Bucs, and here you see this pattern continue. Several players from the Bucs now, and that just speaks volume to the defensive matchup they have to go up against versus the Packers. So many injuries there, and makes it a favorable one. Now, I think you're really starting to see O.J. Howard becoming that #1 tight end, kind of edging out Cameron Brate. And regardless whether it's Fitzpatrick or Jameis Winston, I think he can have some success again. Came off 3 receptions for 52 yards versus the Falcons. And behind Mike Evans, to me, he is that next guy. So if you need a tight end play that has the potential, has the nice matchup, O.J. Howard is that guy. Continuing with Julius Thomas of the Dolphins. Now, look, has a tough matchup versus the Broncos this week, but he is coming off of 5 receptions for 52 yards versus the Patriots, and I will say no matter who it is, Cutler or Matt Moore, Julius Thomas does get his targets, and versus the Broncos defense, you know, I think they're going to be putting on pressure whoever it is at quarterback, and those short intermediate routes are really going to be where they have to make their living that game, and to me, that speaks volumes as to the potential Julius Thomas has. That is kind of his area as far as where he roams. Also, a big red zone target, another reason why I like him. And to me, he is that safety blanket for whoever is that quarterback. So again, if available off waivers, try and put in a request for him. Could potentially play out this week and pay out. And finally, Ricky Jones of the Cardinals. Now, coming off a really big game, 4 receptions, 72 yards, and a touchdown versus the Jaguars. Really impressive performance considering the defense. And to me, here, obviously, the matchup is going to be tough versus the Rams next week. Those divisional matchups, they're either going to be a blowout, and let's be honest, if it's a blowout, it's going to be in favor of the Rams, or it's going to be a hard-fought, ugly game. And either way, I think that favors Ricky Jones, because if it's a blowout, Cardinals have to air it out even more. if it's a hard, fought game, it's going to be in between the trenches. It's going to be those short intermediate passes. And Ricky Jones, again, has the advantage there. So for me, he has the favorable matchup regardless of the outcome. Blaine Gabbert getting more and more familiar with that connection. So if you can, throw in your hat in the ring to see if you can pick him up. And if not, don't fret. There are, like I mentioned, some other options at the tight end position. And now finally getting to the all-important defensive pickups. Starting with the Redskins, they go up against the Dallas Cowboys Thursday in Dallas. Would have been nice to see the game in Washington and have that home support for the Redskins, but it doesn't really matter because last couple weeks without Z, the Dallas Cowboys offense has looked atrocious. And starting with Dak, honestly at this point he has become a bench candidate. Dez nowhere to be found. That running game, no life, even with Tyron Smith reinserted in the lineup last week. And look, I think this plays it in the hands of the Skins exactly how they needed to. If you looked at last couple performances defensively versus the Cowboys, they've all had some really nice success, and I really think that Washington is going to see that success continue. At this point, to me, they're in a better position than the Cowboys to make a push for the playoffs. I think that's going to factor into this, and at the end of the day, I expect the Redskins to have right around 10 or if not more points defensively. Next, I want to look at the Chargers defense, coming off a really nice performance versus the Cowboys Thursday, and now they get the Cleveland Browns, the still winless Cleveland Browns. And where to start here? First of all, home game for the Chargers. Are going to have that support behind them. That always helps. On top of that, look, the Browns are winless, and they just keep making mistakes wherever it is, whether it's in the run game, wherever it's in the pass game. I know they're going to get Josh Gordon back, but even if he does get a touchdown and a couple of targets, I still expect the Chargers defense to have a good game with Bosa there, with Ingram there. That's a defensive force in the secondary as well. I expect Kaiser to make mistakes, and pretty much at this point, whoever plays the Browns is a decent pickup, a decent play, right around 10 points. Definitely think the Chargers can do the same. And finally, the last addition defensively, Chicago Bears going up at home versus the 49ers. And to me, this is going to be depending a lot on whether CJ or Garoppolo plays. Honestly, Garoppolo scares me more in terms of the offensive potential he provides for the 49ers than that of CJ. And if CJ does play, to me, that maybe says he's not 100%, so the Bears can maybe capitalize on that. And at this point, neither of these teams is a good football team. The 49ers are young, they're mistake prone, and the Bears, they're not good offensively either, but their strength lies in their defense. And even though they are getting injured, they still have some playmakers there. Even though there's craziness in the locker room, calls to fire Fox, he's going to try and salvage at least a couple wins. And I can see this being, a decent matchup if you were desperate for a defense. But again, I will say, to me, the potential is much higher for a good performance of the Bears if CJ plays. So keep an eye out on that. And if he is suiting up, I would roll with the Bears defense. So with all that being said, that pretty much wraps up my guys to keep an eye out for this week and to target. Let me know, what did you guys think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are there names that you would add, names that you would omit? And as always, if you have any questions, let me hear it in the comments section. And if you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and I'll make sure to see you guys in future videos.